I stood waist-deep in muddy water, holding a shovel like it was a battle axe, while Karen from the HOA screamed at me from behind the yellow caution tape she had the audacity to put on my property. Her voice cracked like a rusty gate as she pointed to her clipboard and yelled, "You can't drain it! That pond belongs to the community." Behind her stood two men in wrinkled suits who looked like they'd been plucked off a budget legal ad on late-night TV. One of them stepped forward and said, "Sir, you've been served." That was the exact moment I turned to the camera mounted on my fence, looked straight into the lens, and said, "If they think this is community property, they better be ready to share the thorns too." And with that, I drove the shovel into the earth like I was starting a revolution. It all began 6 months earlier, when my peaceful retirement was shattered by a letter slid under my door. I'm Ray Mitchell, 62, retired botany professor, widower, and lifelong lover of quiet. I bought this land 5 years ago after my wife passed, and I chose it for 2 reasons: the spring-fed pond in the backyard and the ironclad deed that clearly stated everything within the boundary. Pond, trees, boulders, and all was mine. I'm not in an HOA. I never signed up, and my land was zoned separately, thank goodness. But that didn't stop them from trying. Back when I first moved in, the HOA had just been established across the road, and I didn't pay them any attention. Why would I? They didn't govern my property, and I certainly didn't want them to. For the first few years it was fine. They had their bake sales and trash pickup days and left me alone. But then Karen got elected president. She didn't just wear power, she weaponized it. Karen had the type of face that always looked offended, and a tone that turned every question into an accusation. She walked like she owned the whole street and talked like she owned the zip code. She first approached me under the guise of beautifying the neighborhood. She knocked on my door with her trademark forced smile and said, "Ray, the community's been talking, and we think your pond would make a lovely reflection area for our walking group." I blinked at her. "What walking group?" I asked. "Oh, we haven't formed it yet, but the idea is very popular." Translation: she decided it was happening. I told her no, politely at first. Then firmly. Then I stopped opening the door altogether. That's when the letters started. They accused me of denying community access to a natural resource. They claimed the pond was on common green space. They included laughably inaccurate maps that showed my property lines redrawn to include the pond within their community feature zone. I called my lawyer, Mr. Harlan, an old friend who owed me more favors than he liked to admit. He reviewed my deed, looked at their nonsense, and chuckled. "They're bluffing," he said. "But they're serious. These people are bold and dumb, and that's a dangerous combo." I tried being diplomatic. I showed up at one of their board meetings, sat through 30 minutes of Karen reciting parking violations like she was reading scripture, then raised my hand when the floor opened. "I'd like to clarify some misinformation regarding the pond on my land," I said calmly. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Your pond," she echoed, like I'd just confessed to stealing a national monument. "It's on our green space map." She pulled out a colorful pamphlet with clip art trees and a big smiling sun right over where my pond used to be. I held up my survey papers. "This is from the county, dated before your HOA even existed. That pond is on my land." She scoffed. "Well, we'll just have to see what a court says." They weren't bluffing. A week later, I got a cease and desist letter. They claimed I was blocking community access, destroying shared wildlife habitat, and refusing to cooperate with HOA bylaws, even though none applied to me. Harlan told me we could fight it and we'd win, but it'd take time and money. "You could file for injunctive relief," he offered. I said no. "I have a better idea. They want the pond? Let's give them something worth remembering." That's when I started draining it. Quietly at first. I rerouted the spring using a system I designed back when I was testing drought conditions on native plant. I notified the county of the change in use, filed the proper environmental paperwork, and began converting my pond into something far more educational and much less pleasant. I started planting thorn bushes. Not your garden variety roses either. We're talking pyracantha, devil's walking stick, and honey locust. All legal, all nasty. I know my plants, and I know how to make them bite. Karen noticed the water level dropping and showed up again, this time with a news crew. That's when things got ridiculous. She told them I was destroying public water, harming frogs, even endangering local butterflies. I stood on the bank, held up my paperwork, and said, "This pond is mine. The only thing I'm endangering is stupidity." The clip aired on local TV. I went viral. "Botanist battles HOA with thorns" was the headline. My inbox filled with support. One guy even mailed me a set of thorn-proof gloves. But the best moment came when Karen tried to retaliate. She had the audacity to send a contractor to build a bench near the edge of what used to be my pond, and on my land. They took down part of my fence without asking. That was the final straw. I reported the trespass. The sheriff came out, saw the tape from my trail cam, and politely told the contractor to pack it up or be arrested. Karen stood there fuming while I nailed the fence boards back up myself. She hissed, "You'll regret this." I looked at the row of thorn sprouts already poking through the mud and said, "You might." Now every morning, I walk outside with my coffee and watch the garden grow. I've got a camera set up to monitor the area. Not for security, but for entertainment. Karen's not done. I know that. But neither am I. They wanted to play dirty with paperwork and fake map. I've got patience, plants, and legal documents older than their HOA charter. They thought they were dealing with some quiet old man with a pond. What they got was a retired botanist with a vendetta and a shovel, and I'm just getting started. Karen's scream still echoed in my mind long after she'd stomped off my property like she was marching into a courtroom with nothing but blind confidence and a folder full of lies. The satisfaction of watching her realize the pond wasn't hers to claim was only matched by the silent joy of watching the water level drop day by day. I hadn't just started draining the pond for spite. This was a strategy. Every gallon that disappeared signaled that I wasn't just defending my land, I was reclaiming the narrative. If they wanted a war, I was going to give them a horticultural one. And I wasn't bluffing. The first wave of thorn bushes had taken root along the now exposed banks, and even in their juvenile stage, those little devils already had attitude. Firethorn, aptly named, had berries that looked beautiful but came with needles like angry sewing pins. Devil's walking stick sprouted like a medieval weapon in plant form, and black locust, the crown jewel of my plan, grew like weeds with spines that could shred jeans. Most people would have hesitated, afraid of violating some obscure ordinance or getting hit with retaliation fines. But I'd done my homework. I knew the county codes better than most of the people who enforced them. I wasn't just a passive landowner. I was a man who had spent 35 years in academia, teaching students how nature works and how it defends itself when pushed. Nature wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes it was brutal, protective, and elegant in its defense. And now, so was I. Word began to spread faster than I'd anticipated. It started with a clip of the HOA meeting where Karen tried to call me out publicly, only for me to calmly display the county survey like a magician pulling a deed from a hat. Someone had filmed the exchange and posted it online with the caption, "Karen tries to steal a pond, botanist drops facts." By the end of the day, it had racked up thousands of views. The next morning, I woke up to interview requests, emails from former students cheering me on, and one message from a stranger that simply read, "Build the thorn wall." Karen, of course, couldn't handle being the joke of the week. She came by again, uninvited as always, this time flanked by a local news crew. The reporter, a young woman who looked way too excited to be covering pond politics, asked me if I'd be willing to make a statement. I told her I'd be happy to, as long as I could show them the original property documents, the old aerial photos, and the environmental permits I filed. She agreed. I walked them through it all, every legal step, every measured boundary. Then I pointed to the little sign I had nailed to the oak tree by the old dock. It read, "Not yours. Not ever." They asked Karen for comment. She sputtered through some nonsense about how the community deserved access to natural spaces and how my refusal to cooperate was damaging neighborly relations. But when asked if she could produce a single legal document proving community ownership, she changed the subject. The footage aired that evening, but what really exploded online was the unedited video a neighbor had taken. It showed Karen slipping on a patch of mud while trying to point out where the property line obviously ends, landing on her rear with a loud splat and a very unpresidential scream. The internet branded her Pond Karen, and for the first time in her reign of passive-aggressive terror, she didn't have control of the narrative. But what she lacked in public perception, she made up for with stubbornness. A few days later, a county code enforcement officer knocked on my door. He was polite, mid-40s, and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He told me there had been an anonymous complaint about unlicensed land modifications and water rerouting. I raised an eyebrow and handed him a folder thicker than a steak sandwich, full of my permits, signatures, and environmental compliance paperwork. He looked through it, nodded, and said, "I figured this was nonsense, but we still have to check. Honestly, I've seen your video. My wife made me watch it 3 times. He smiled as he left, whispering, "Good luck with the thorns." Then came the next move. Karen wasn't subtle. She started trying to pressure other neighbors into siding with her. I heard from one guy down the road that she'd been knocking on doors, warning people that I was a toxic presence in the community and could drive down property values. That might have worked on folks who hadn't seen the footage or who still feared her clipboard, but more and more people were beginning to realize she was bluffing. A few of them even came over to see the Thorn garden for themselves. I started calling it that half-jokingly, but the name stuck. It wasn't just bushes now. I had started adding layers. Barberry shrubs for low-level coverage. Wild blackberry plants for density. Even some artfully placed bramble mounds for aesthetics and security. The best part? Every single plant was chosen not just for its thorns, but for being native, eco-friendly, and completely defensible in court. If they wanted to accuse me of creating a hostile environment, I was more than ready to give them a walking tour, though I'd suggest bringing gloves. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. At the next HOA meeting, which someone kindly live-streamed, she lost her cool when one of the other board members questioned the expense of the failed legal claim against me. She shouted something about personal betrayal and how dare you side with the Thorn man. That little clip made it onto a local meme page, and just like that, her reign started to crumble. The board wasn't just embarrassed. They were starting to realize she was costing them credibility and cash. But the most unexpected moment came when I caught her trespassing. My trail cams picked it up. It was just after dusk. She came through the side, probably thinking the bushes weren't grown enough to stop her. She tried to get closer to what was left of the pond, maybe hoping to find something that could justify her obsession. Instead, she stepped into a patch of freshly watered black locust and slipped. The thorns didn't draw blood, but her pride took a beating. She scrambled out, limping, and vanished into the night. The footage was clear. I submitted it to the sheriff's office along with a formal trespass complaint. The sheriff paid her a visit the next day. Nothing dramatic, just a friendly reminder that breaking onto private property, even for someone who runs the HOA, isn't legal. I didn't press charges. I didn't need to. The message had been delivered. After that, things got quieter. For a while. But I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen don't back down, they regroup. She'd be back with another plan, another scheme. I didn't know what it would be, but I knew I'd be ready. My garden wasn't finished growing yet. The thorns were only just beginning. Spring brought with it the kind of bloom only a determined botanist with a grudge could cultivate. What was once a serene pond with chirping frogs and glassy reflections had now transformed into something far more poetic and far less inviting. It was a tangled masterpiece of thorns, vines, and twisted beauty that stretched across the former waterline like a living fortress. Anyone passing by could tell it wasn't just landscaping. It was a declaration. The perimeter was lined with firethorn, its clusters of blood-red berries belying the needles that hid beneath. Barberry formed a natural fence at ankle height, ready to snag the unsuspecting. Taller, stronger black locusts rose like silent guards, and between them, my pride and joy, Devil's walking stick, towered with its grotesque elegance, its spiny stalks daring anyone to test its defenses. I called it the Garden of Regret. My neighbors had started calling it that too. They said it with a chuckle, a bit of awe, and maybe just a pinch of fear. There was no mistaking the message anymore. Karen and the HOA had lost the fight for my pond, and I had replaced it with a monument to consequences. It wasn't just revenge, it was art. Even better, it was completely legal art. I documented every stage of growth, submitted everything to the local conservation department, and invited a biologist from the state university to visit. She loved it, called it a brilliant example of using native thorn-bearing plants for property defense and invasive deterrent. She even asked to use photos in a textbook. I told her she could, as long as the caption included the phrase, created in response to HOA harassment. That week, I installed a wooden sign near the edge of the property facing the sidewalk. Carved with care, it read, "Garden of Regret, trespassers will be pricked." It was whimsical enough to be funny but stern enough to get the point across. I noticed people walking their dogs would cross the street rather than get too close. It was working better than a security fence, and far prettier. Karen, however, hadn't learned a thing. She shifted tactics again, now weaponizing the HOA's handbook to try and regain control. I received a notice in the mail accusing me of violating neighborhood aesthetic policies, due to the appearance of my mailbox. That mailbox, mind you, had been in place since I moved in. It was a standard wooden post with a metal box, nothing fancy, nothing offensive. But because I'd recently added a small planter around the base filled with thornless roses and solar lights, suddenly it was a non-compliant modification. I saw the letter and laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. I knew exactly what this was. A pathetic attempt to make me bow to her authority after failing to seize the pond. So instead of arguing, I went the opposite direction. I rebuilt the mailbox into a full-blown miniature fortress. I crafted a wooden frame shaped like a castle turret, painted it a calm beige to match county specs, and surrounded it with carefully trimmed thorn-covered vines. Not touching the sidewalk, of course. Decorative only. Then I added a small, motion-activated camera hidden in a lantern. When triggered, it played a pre-recorded message that said, "Welcome to my lawful mailbox. Please enjoy your walk." Karen came by with a tape measure one morning, clipboard in hand, determined to prove it violated some obscure measurement requirement. Unfortunately for her, one of the thorny vines snagged her skirt, and in her panic to pull away, she lost her footing and fell backward onto the curb. My camera caught the whole thing. I didn't post it anywhere. I had learned that going too public made her more desperate, but I sent it to Harlan just in case. He replied with one sentence, "You're turning petty into performance art." Karen's next move came through a third party. A contractor hired by the HOA showed up unannounced, claiming he needed to inspect my property for community irrigation damage. I told him to leave immediately. He tried to talk over me, said he had authorization. I asked to see it. He fumbled through his truck and pulled out a piece of paper that wasn't even signed. It was just a memo with HOA letterhead. I told him, calmly, that he was trespassing. He got defensive. Then I smiled and pointed to the small blinking red light on the corner of my fence, the hidden camera. "I'd suggest you leave before the sheriff gets here," I said. He left without another word. 2 days later, the irrigation reroute I had legally installed showed signs of tampering. My spring-fed water supply was no longer flowing correctly. That's when I knew Karen had tried something more than petty letters. Fortunately, I had anticipated sabotage. I had installed 2 decoy pipes above ground, cheap plastic lines that didn't actually go anywhere. The real system was buried and armored. The moment the pressure changed in the decoy, a sensor tripped and sent a photo and GPS ping to my phone. I drove out there, found the damaged decoy line, and saw muddy boot prints leading right to the sidewalk. I filed a police report. Later that week, I heard through the grapevine, literally, from a neighbor I'd given grapevine clippings to, that the handyman Karen hired had been picked up for unrelated theft charges and spilled the details about being hired to mess with the pond guy's water system. My name came up in his confession. Karen's name did too. Nothing formally came of it, but the whispers started. The HOA board started to fracture. Her vice president, a tired-looking guy named Ron, started skipping meetings. Another member, Lisa, who had never liked me, knocked on my door to apologize and said, "Honestly, Ray, I think she's gone too far. I just offered her some herbal tea from my garden and said, nature always finds a way to balance itself." From then on, HOA meetings turned into Karen's personal battlefield. She tried pushing new bylaws, tried rewriting policies to get me under their thumb, but the board wasn't having it anymore. One meeting in particular stood out. She stood up, waving her latest drafted motion that would expand the HOA boundaries to clarify land use policy. Ron interrupted her with a question. "Karen, have you actually read Ray's property deed?" Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish trying to explain calculus. Someone in the back muttered, "We're not losing another lawsuit." The vote failed. She sat down, red-faced and shaking. Meanwhile, I kept planting. I added wild roses with hooked thorns, carefully trained to grow in spirals. I planted milk thistle, not because it was thorny but because it added visual flair. My garden wasn't just defensive anymore, it was drawing attention. I had a few visitors who asked if they could photograph it. One was a young artist who called it a symbol of resistance through cultivation. I chuckled and told her to be careful near the barberry. She still ended up getting snagged, but she loved it. By the time the season was at its peak, the Garden of Regret had become both a private fortress and a public curiosity. Karen's attempts to reclaim power kept backfiring. Her reputation was now tied to one word: thorns. Every plan she tried, every dirty trick, ended up pricking her instead. And as for me, I kept watering, pruning, and smiling from my porch, knowing full well the best revenge isn't just making a point, it's letting your enemies walk straight into it, thorns and all. By midsummer, the air was thick with heat and humiliation, though only one of those came from the weather. Karen's grip on the HOA had gone from ironclad to butterfingered, and it was glorious to watch from the comfort of my front porch. I sipped my iced tea like it was a front-row ticket to the downfall of a dictator. My Garden of Regret was thriving, lush and terrible, beautiful and unforgiving. The former pond basin had become an ecosystem of pointed justice, with layers of native thorny plants now in full bloom. The colors were deceptive, soft pinks, deep purples, vibrant reds, but beneath those petals were needles, hooks, and nature's answer to idiocy. The bushes hissed in the wind like they shared my mood. I didn't have to say anything anymore. The thorns did all the talking. Of course, Karen wasn't done making a fool of herself. She had one more grand plan, and it was just as dramatic and misguided as every scheme that came before it. One morning, I noticed activity near the sidewalk that lined the edge of my property. Orange cones, folding chairs, a banner that read, "Save the green space," written in Comic Sans with a frog graphic pasted in the corner. It took all of my restraint not to burst out laughing. Karen had organized a protest. She gathered a ragtag group of HOA loyalists and a few bored retirees to wave signs at passing cars. Most of the signs didn't even make sense. One said, "Return the pond." Another said, "Nature belongs to all," as if I had bulldozed a rainforest and replaced it with asphalt. Karen herself wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and held a megaphone like she was leading a revolution. She shouted, "The people will not be silenced," over and over while no one responded. I leaned on my fence and watched them for a while. They were loud, sweaty, and clearly confused about what they were even fighting for. I could have ignored it, could have let it fizzle out, but I decided to offer refreshments instead. I walked down my driveway with a tray of lemonade and a smile. Karen saw me and hissed into her megaphone, "We do not negotiate with tyrants." I offered a cup to a man in the back who looked more confused than committed. He took it. Karen tried to snatch it from him, but the man stepped away and whispered, "It's really good lemonade." A local news crew arrived not long after. Same one as before. They seemed less interested this time. The reporter asked Karen a few polite questions and then walked over to me. I showed her the same survey documents I'd shown before, and added a few fresh letters from the county confirming everything I'd done was legal and approved. The segment they aired that evening was 30 seconds long and included Karen yelling, "We demand restoration," and a quick cut to me saying, "I just planted native plants on my private land. But sure, restore away." Not long after that debacle, I received a formal visit from the county assessor's office. Apparently, another anonymous report had been filed suggesting that my land improvements had increased the taxable value of my property. I knew where this was going. Karen was trying to get me hit with a higher property tax bill to make my life harder. The assessor, a man named Joe who looked like he'd been working the job since the Carter administration, took one slow walk around the property, examined the Thorn garden, and chuckled. No commercial activity, no structures, no irrigation violations. Just a lot of sharp plants. I nodded. He added, "Honestly, this is one of the more creative uses of land I've seen." "You got a name for it?" I pointed to the sign. "Garden of Regret." He laughed and scribbled something on his clipboard. A week later, I received the official letter. No change in property valuation. No tax hike. No issue. Word of Karen's meddling reached more people than she'd intended. The county office was not happy about being dragged into a petty war over a patch of land that wasn't even theirs to begin with. A memo was circulated internally warning departments to verify claims made by HOAs before acting on them. It even included a case reference, mine. Karen had officially become an internal example of what not to do. Her influence was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater. But the final blow didn't come from me. It came from her own people. The HOA board had been growing restless for weeks. Whispers turned into side conversations, which turned into scheduled meetings without Karen. Eventually, the board called an emergency session. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. Half the neighborhood was watching it unfold in real time. They held the meeting in the community center across from my property. A few curious onlookers gathered outside. I stood across the street trimming my vines while pretending not to listen. Inside, things escalated fast. Ron, the vice president, finally stood up for what was right. He pointed out that Karen's actions had cost the HOA money, time, and credibility. Her obsession with my land had turned their meetings into spectacles, their members into jokes, and their policies into kindling. He motioned to have her removed as president. Karen shouted about betrayal and legality and how I was the enemy of community cohesion. But no one backed her. The vote wasn't even close. She was stripped of her title and asked to resign from the board entirely. Her face as she walked out of that room was a twisted mix of disbelief and barely contained rage. She didn't look like a leader. She looked like a sore loser who finally got caught cheating. The new president was Hank, a retired Marine with a buzz cut and a no-nonsense attitude. First thing he did was knock on my door, shake my hand, and apologize. He said the board had been misled and that they would no longer pursue any claim regarding my property. I told him I appreciated the gesture but didn't trust words alone. He understood. That's when I handed him a paper. It was a request for the HOA to install a permanent sign near their walkway confirming that the Thorn garden was outside their jurisdiction. Not only did he agree, he personally delivered the check to cover the cost. I ordered the sign that day. It read, "Keep out. Experimental Botanical Zone. HOA access prohibited." Karen tried to spin the situation one last time, posting online about how she had been unfairly silenced, how I had manipulated the board, and how I was a danger to the community. But it didn't gain traction. Her posts were met with laughter, mockery, and screenshots of her earlier failures. The video of her slipping in the mud made another round on social media, this time with dramatic music and slow-motion effect. After that, she stopped showing her face around the neighborhood. Her front lawn grew over. Her mailbox leaned. No more clipboard walk. No more impromptu meetings. She had been dethroned, not by rage or force, but by reason, by law, and by nature. As for me, I went back to my garden. I trimmed the devil's walking sticks, watered the firethorn, and started preparing a new section near the rear fence for a particularly thorny cactus I'd ordered from Arizona. Not because I needed more protection. Just because it made me smile. Every leaf, every prickle, every bloom was a reminder that sometimes, the best way to end a fight is to let your enemies walk into something sharp, loud, and entirely of their own making. The strange thing about conflict is that when it ends, the silence that follows almost feels louder. After Karen's downfall and the HOA's official surrender, the neighborhood transformed into something resembling normalcy. The protest signs vanished. The late-night complaints stopped. Even the petty letters stopped arriving. What replaced them was something unexpected: curiosity. People who once avoided me now slowed their walks to glance at the thorny masterpiece I had sculpted from spite and patience. The Garden of Regret, once considered an act of war, became a symbol of quiet resistance, even beauty in its own sharp-edged way. And like anything that draws attention, it soon attracted more than just neighbors. It began with a knock on my door one Saturday morning. A man and woman stood there with matching canvas vests, clipboards in hand, and official-looking badges that said State Conservation Council. I thought they were here to ask about water rerouting or possibly investigate another baseless complaint from Karen's final tantrums, but I was wrong. They were researchers, part of a team working on native habitat preservation. They had seen a local article featuring my story and wanted to document the garden for their program. I gave them the tour, warned them about the sharper corners, and watched their faces light up with fascination. They took pictures, asked about my methods, and even brought a soil sampler. By the end of the day, they asked if I'd be willing to let student groups visit for educational purposes. I said yes, as long as they came with gloves and a liability waiver. Within weeks, my property became an unexpected destination for field trips, local nature clubs, and even landscape designers. I started putting out orange flags near the most dangerous plants and added a small gravel path to guide visitors. The mailbox fortress became a selfie spot. Parents brought kids to learn about native flora, and a few retirees stopped by just to sit on the bench outside the fence and enjoy the sight. Some called it the sharpest garden in the county. Others just called it brilliant. I kept my head down, but I couldn't help feeling a swell of pride knowing something born out of frustration had turned into something admired, even celebrated. Meanwhile, Karen's house had gone dark. The once perfectly trimmed hedges now leaned like tired soldiers. Her mailbox had been dented for weeks, and her lawn, once the envy of the block, had grown shaggy and uneven. Rumor had it she had tried to sell the place, hoping to start over in another neighborhood, one presumably free of thorn-wielding nemesis. But she had a problem. Her reputation had outpaced her. Between the viral videos, the news clips, and the community whispers, no one wanted to buy the house once owned by the woman who tried to steal a pond and got buried in thorns instead. A couple of potential buyers visited, but none stayed long. One couple reportedly asked if the property came with the right to complain about other people's yards. The agent had laughed awkwardly and never called them back. Karen tried listing it again, this time with a new agency and a suspiciously vague property description that read, "Charming home with natural views." But buyers did their research, and it didn't take long for online search results to pull up photos of her sitting in mud with a twisted ankle and a headline that read, "HOA president gets pricked by her own rules." She slashed the price twice. Still no offers. Eventually, a for rent sign appeared in her window, the kind that looks like a white flag waving in defeat. Last I heard, a college student and his dog moved in. He installed a hammock, put up a pride flag, and played jazz in the evenings. I liked him already. With Karen gone and the HOA under new leadership, the atmosphere in the neighborhood genuinely shifted. Hank, the new president, lived by a rule I could respect. Don't start problems you can't legally finish. He visited a few more times, just to check in, and eventually stopped by with his wife to see the garden up close. She left with clippings and a full camera roll. I gave Hank a jar of homemade blackberry jam. We didn't become best friends, but we found something rare in HOA country: mutual respect. I added a final touch to the edge of my property, just where the old pond used to meet the walking path Karen had once claimed for the community. I installed a small wooden archway, not for entry, but as a frame for what lay beyond. On it, carved in firm, deep lettering, were the words, "Nature defends itself." Beneath that, in smaller letters, "Formerly a pond. Still private property." It wasn't angry. It was matter of fact. People understood the message, and the few who didn't quickly learned when they wandered too close to the barberry. Not everything stayed perfect. There were still occasional grumbles. One neighbor complained that my black locust trees dropped too many seed pods on windy days. I offered to help him rake. Another wanted to know if the thorns could hurt pet. I explained that dogs had better instincts than humans. We shared a laugh, and I showed him a safer walking route. Slowly, people realized I wasn't a recluse or a villain. I was just a man who loved his land and knew how to protect it with more than fences and lawyers. Over time, the garden of regret began evolving. I planted milkweed to attract butterflies, included a wildflower patch to balance the brutality of the thorns, and even added a bench inside the interior fence line for myself. I'd sit there in the early morning, coffee in hand, listening to the buzzing of bees and the occasional squirrel daring the thorns for a snack. I didn't miss the pond. Not anymore. It had served its purpose. Now, in its place was something alive in a way still water could never be. Karen faded into a cautionary tale. New residents were told about her in hushed, humorous tones. Her name became shorthand for what not to do. "Don't go full Karen," they'd say, "or you'll end up like the Thorn lady." It was crude. It was funny. And it was exactly the kind of poetic justice you couldn't buy with a court ruling or win with a speech. I sometimes imagined what she must have felt, sitting in her empty house, watching everything she'd tried to control slip away, one vine at a time. Maybe she hated me. Maybe she learned something. Maybe she'd go on to make another HOA miserable somewhere else. But that was no longer my concern. I'd done what I needed to do. I defended my land, my rights, and my peace. And I did it with roots, thorns, and patience. The last time I saw someone approach with a clipboard, I almost laughed. But it wasn't a threat. It was a journalist from a gardening magazine. She wanted to do a feature on suburban botanical defenses. I welcomed her in, pointed to the devil's walking stick, and said, "It all started with a pond someone else tried to claim. Now it's a fortress with petals." She asked what I called it. I smiled and said, "Some call it the Garden of Regret. I call it home." Then I walked her down the path, through the arch, past the thorns, and into the story that nature and I had written together. One prick at a time.